Some men are born for war, and some men survive it. Odysseus was both. For 10 years, the greatest warriors in Greece had thrown themselves against the walls of Troy and gotten nothing. Until Odysseus had an idea. It was not a battle plan, nor an assault. It was a trick. A wooden horse. Enormous. Hollow inside. Large enough to conceal the finest Greek soldiers in its belly. Beautiful enough to make the Trojans want to bring it home. The Greeks pretended to retreat. They left the horse on the beach like an offering to the gods and vanished over the horizon. They dragged it inside themselves. That night, Troy celebrated the end of the war. And while they celebrated, the gates opened from within. What followed was not a battle. It was a massacre. Flames swallowed the sky. The streets of Troy, which had held for 10 years against everything, burned in a single night. It was not the fall of a city. It was the erasure of a world. King Priam fell. Helen was taken back. And the most powerful city in the ancient world was reduced to ash and silence. Odysseus had won. It was the greatest moment of his life. When the ships finally turned west and the fires of Troy faded behind him, there was only one thing on his mind. Not glory, not the years of war, not even the men he had lost. Just one face, one name, Penelope, his wife, who had been waiting for him for 10 years. He just wanted to go home. But the gods were watching, and not all of them were pleased with what they saw. The Greeks had not simply won a war. They had desecrated temples, insulted the immortals, and mistaken the favor of the gods for their own greatness. And Poseidon, god of the sea, master of every wave and every storm, was furious. The sea waiting for them was not the same one they had crossed 10 years before. Odysseus didn't know that yet. He still believed the hardest part was behind him. He was wrong. The first stop on his way back was the coast of the Cicones, allies of Troy, enemies by default. Odysseus knew the right move. Keep sailing, stay invisible, don't stop. But his men had been at war for 10 years, and 10 years of discipline collapses the moment the fighting stops. They landed, raided the nearest city, took everything they could carry, and made camp on the beach to celebrate. Odysseus told them to leave before dawn. They didn't listen. By morning, the Cicones had called in reinforcements from inland. And while Odysseus's men were still sleeping, a fresh army came over the hills. Mounted, armed, and ready for a fight his crew was in no shape for. By the time they pulled back to the ships, 72 men were dead. Not killed by monsters or gods, killed by their own inability to know when the war was over. Odysseus pulled the fleet away from that shore, saying nothing. The sea pushed them south, and before the grief had time to settle, Zeus sent a storm that drove them off course for 2 days straight. When it cleared, they found themselves on a shore none of them recognized. Warm, quiet, and filled with the smell of strange flowers. The people there were harmless, welcoming even. They offered Odysseus's men a taste of what they lived on. Lotus flowers, soft and sweet, and unlike anything they'd eaten before. The men who ate them forgot about home, not all at once, but piece by piece. The ships, the mission, everything they were sailing toward, it dissolved, replaced by a heavy, comfortable nothing. They sat on the beach with blank smiles, perfectly happy to stay there forever. Odysseus didn't argue with them. He dragged them back to the ships by force, had them tied to their benches, and ordered the fleet to move before anyone else had a chance to taste the flowers. Some of them were still reaching back toward the shore as the island disappeared. He understood why. After everything they'd been through, forgetting sounded like relief. But Odysseus couldn't forget. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing: Penelope waiting. And as long as she was waiting, he had no right to stop moving. And so the ship sailed on, deeper into unknown waters, towards something far worse than what they'd left behind. Nobody warned them about the island. After the storm and the losses at the Cicones, the fleet was running low on food. When they spotted land, rocky cliffs, dense forest, a smaller uninhabited island just offshore with wild goats roaming free, they stopped to resupply. They spent a day hunting, eating, recovering. And from across the narrow strait, they could see the larger island, caves along the hillside, smoke rising somewhere inland, signs of life. Odysseus wanted to know what kind. He took 12 of his best men and crossed over at dawn. They followed the sound of heavy movement into the hills until they found a cave so large it could have sheltered the ships themselves. Inside, enormous clay pots filled with milk, wheels of cheese stacked to the ceiling, stone pens full of lambs and baby goats separated by age. Whoever lived here was not a man. His men wanted to grab the food and leave. Odysseus wanted to stay. He wanted to see who lived there. That decision would cost him everything. When the Cyclops returned that evening, he was unlike anything they had ever seen. A single, massive eye. A body the size of a hillside. He moved boulders the way a man moves chairs. He sealed the entrance to the cave with a stone that 100 men couldn't have shifted, built a fire, and only then noticed his guests. His name was Polyphemus, son of Poseidon. Odysseus told him they were travelers, guests protected by the laws of the gods. The Cyclops answered by grabbing 2 of his men and eating them where they stood. Just like that. No hesitation. No warning. There was no negotiation after that. No escape either. The stone at the entrance was immovable. They were trapped inside the cave of a monster who planned to eat them all. So Odysseus started thinking. He found a massive wooden stake in the cave and sharpened its tip. Then he waited. And when the Cyclops returned, he offered him wine. Strong, sweet wine they had brought from the ships. Polyphemus drank, then asked his guest's name, and Odysseus smiled.
"My name is Nobody,"
he said. The Cyclops laughed and promised that nobody would be the last one eaten. A gift, he called it. Then the wine took hold and he crashed to the ground like a falling mountain. Odysseus didn't waste a second. He drove the sharpened stake into the Cyclops' eye. The scream shook the cave walls. Polyphemus tore the stake out and screamed for his neighbors. Other Cyclopes who came running from across the island, calling through the sealed entrance, asking what was wrong, who had hurt him.
"Nobody!"
Polyphemus screamed.
"Nobody is killing me!"
The others shrugged and walked away. By morning, blinded and howling, Polyphemus rolled the stone aside to let his flock out to graze, running his hands along their backs to make sure no man escaped with them. What he didn't check was underneath. Odysseus and his men clung to the wool of the rams as the animals walked calmly out of the cave, carrying them to freedom. The escape was brilliant. It was flawless. And then Odysseus ruined it. As the ships pulled away from the island, safe, out of reach, the pride of a man who had just outwitted a monster was louder than reason. He stood at the stern and shouted back at the shore.
"My name is Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca. Remember that name."
Polyphemus didn't curse him blindly. He reached his hands to the sky and called out to his father, "Poseidon, god of the sea," and asked him to make sure Odysseus never reached home. Or if he did, that he would arrive late, alone, and broken, on a stranger's ship to find nothing but suffering waiting for him. Poseidon heard every word. And out on the open sea, with Ithaca still far away and Penelope still waiting, Odysseus had just made the most powerful enemy in the world. Not with a mistake, not with a crime, with his own name. After the Cyclops, the sea felt different. The men rowed in silence, watching the horizon like it might turn on them at any moment. They had survived a monster. They had lost men. And somewhere beneath the waves, the god of the sea was now their enemy. But then, for the first time since leaving Troy, luck seemed to change. They reached the floating island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. He welcomed Odysseus into his home, fed his crew, listened to his story. And when the time came to leave, he gave him a gift. All the winds of the world sealed inside a leather bag. Only the west wind was left free, enough to carry them straight to Ithaca. For 9 days they sailed without stopping. 9 days of steady wind and open water. Odysseus barely slept, keeping his hand on the bag, watching the horizon. And on the 10th day, they could see it. The coastline of Ithaca, close enough to make out the hills. He finally let himself rest. That was his mistake. While he slept, his men stared at the bag. They had been whispering about it for days, convinced it was full of gold and treasure that Odysseus was keeping for himself. The moment his eyes closed, they opened it. Every wind in the world burst out at once. The storm hit instantly. It picked up the fleet and threw it back across the sea as if 9 days of sailing had meant nothing. When it was over, they were right back where they had started, at the island of Aeolus, who looked at them, shook his head, and turned them away. He wanted nothing to do with men the gods had clearly marked for destruction. There was nothing left to do but row. Without wind, without luck, exhausted and running short on everything, they rowed for 6 days until they reached a land called Laestrygonia. A quiet bay, surrounded by steep cliffs, with a narrow entrance. Most of the fleet sailed in without hesitation. It looked like shelter. Odysseus anchored outside. Something about it felt wrong. He sent 3 men ahead to find out who lived there. They found a girl who led them to her father, a king the size of a mountain. He grabbed one of the men and ate him on the spot. The other 2 ran screaming back to the bay. What came next happened too fast to stop. The Laestrygonians, giants, hundreds of them, lined the cliffs above the bay and started hurling boulders down onto the ships trapped below. They didn't fight. They crushed the ships one by one as the men in the water were speared like fish. Odysseus cut his anchor rope and got out before the giants turned their attention to him. He was the only one who made it. 11 ships gone. Hundreds of men in minutes. He sat at the stern of the last remaining ship and looked back at the bay where his fleet had been. The men who were left said nothing. They had come out of Troy with 12 ships. Now they had one. He thought of Penelope, of what it would mean to come home like this. The last survivor of his own crew, the man who had led them all to their deaths. The thought didn't break him. It steadied him. He couldn't fall apart now. Not yet. Not while she was still waiting. So they kept sailing. For days, no land, no sign of anything. Just the open sea and the weight of everything they had lost. When they finally spotted an island, they didn't even discuss whether to stop. They had no choice. The island was called Aea, where they saw smoke rising from the trees, birds singing as if nothing in the world was wrong. The kind of quiet that meant nothing good. Odysseus divided his men into 2 groups. He sent one group inland to explore, led by a man named Eurylochus. He stayed on the beach with the other half, watching the tree line. Hours passed. Only Eurylochus came back, shaking, barely able to speak. They had found a house deep in the forest with a beautiful woman inside, wolves and lions at her feet that behaved like tame dogs. She had offered them food, wine, a feast laid out as if she had been expecting them, and then, one by one, she had turned them into pigs. Her name was Circe, and she was not a woman. She was a goddess. Odysseus went in alone. On his way through the forest, a young man appeared in his path, Hermes, messenger of the gods, wearing the look of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. He told Odysseus what he was walking into and handed him a herb, small and white-flowered, that would make him immune to Circe's magic. When Circe turned her wand on Odysseus, nothing happened. She stared at him. He stared back, and in that moment something shifted. Not fear, recognition. She had been told about him, or perhaps she simply understood that a man immune to her magic was not a man she could dismiss. She returned his men to their human form, welcomed the entire crew into her home, and offered them rest. Real rest, the first they had known since Troy. They stayed for a year, not by force, not by enchantment, simply because, for the first time in what felt like forever, they were somewhere safe. But one morning, Odysseus woke up and felt it again, the same pull that never went away. Penelope, Ithaca, home. He told Circe it was time to leave. She didn't argue, but she told him something that stopped him cold. Before he could go home, he had to go somewhere else first. He had to sail to the edge of the world, to the land of the dead, and speak to the ghost of a blind prophet named Tiresias, the only one who could tell him how to survive what was still ahead. The land of the dead. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the sea. Then he went to tell his men. Nobody goes to the land of the dead willingly. Odysseus went anyway. Circe had given him instructions, where to sail, what to bring, what to do when he got there. He followed them without question because he had no other choice. The men, when he told them, went pale. One of them, a young sailor named Elpenor, climbed to the roof of Circe's house and fell to his death before they even set sail. They didn't have time to bury him. They sailed north into waters that grew darker and colder with every mile, until the sun disappeared entirely and the world became a place of fog and silence. When they reached the edge, a shore of perpetual twilight where the rivers of the underworld met the sea, Odysseus did exactly as Circe had told him. He dug a pit in the earth, poured offerings into it, and waited. They came almost immediately. Shadows, dozens of them, then hundreds, rising from the darkness and pressing toward the blood in the pit. The only thing that could make them remember what it felt like to be alive. Odysseus held them back with his sword, letting no one drink until Tiresias arrived. The first face he recognized stopped him cold. Elpenor, the young sailor who had fallen from the roof that very morning. Not yet buried, not yet at rest, just a ghost, confused and lost, asking Odysseus to go back and give him a proper burial so he could find peace. He promised. And then Tiresias came. The old prophet drank and spoke with the clarity of someone who exists outside of time. He told Odysseus what lay ahead, the cattle of the sun, god Helios, which his men must not touch under any circumstances, the suitors consuming his palace in Ithaca, and the long road still between him and home, and a warning he would carry for the rest of his life. The journey was not over and the gods were not finished with him yet. When Tiresias finished and faded back into the dark, others came forward. His mother. He hadn't known she was dead. She had been alive when he left for Troy. He tried to hold her, but his arms passed through her like smoke. She told him gently that this was the nature of death, that the body was gone, that only the shadow remained. She told him his father was still alive, but fading. She told him Penelope was still waiting, still faithful, still holding everything together with nothing but stubbornness and hope. He stood there with his arms empty and his chest heavy with something he could barely understand. Then the others came, heroes he had known, men who had died at Troy, faces from another life. Agamemnon, king of kings, killed by his own wife the night he returned home. He grabbed Odysseus by the hand and told him to trust no one, not even the people waiting for him. Ajax, still furious over an old argument about armor, turned away without a word. Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, told him that he would rather be the lowest servant among the living than king of all the dead. Odysseus listened to all of them. He stood at the border between the living and the dead, surrounded by everything he had lost and everything that had been lost before him, and he did not look away. He faced it, the grief, the weight, the enormity of what it meant to still be alive when so many weren't. And then, when the shadows grew too many and the darkness too heavy, he turned back to the ship. He had what he came for. Now, he just had to survive long enough to use it. Circe had warned him about what came next. All of it. She hadn't spared him a single detail because she understood that the only thing more dangerous than knowing what was ahead was not knowing. The first were the Sirens, creatures that lived on a rocky island surrounded by the bones of sailors who had heard their song and steered toward it without being able to stop themselves. The song was not just beautiful, it was personal. Each man heard exactly what he most wanted: his name, his glory, the answers he had spent his life searching for. It was impossible to resist, and everyone who tried was dead. Odysseus didn't try to resist it. He had his men fill their ears with beeswax so they couldn't hear a thing, and then he had them tie him to the mast. Arms bound, unable to move, but ears open. He needed to hear it. When the song reached him, it was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He pulled at the ropes until his wrists bled, screaming at his men to untie him, ordering them, begging them. They couldn't hear a word. They rowed harder and kept their eyes forward, just as he had told them to, until the island was far behind them and the song was gone. He was left trembling against the mast, with the echo of something extraordinary fading from his mind and nothing to show for it but rope burns and the memory of a voice that had known his name. There was no time to recover. Ahead lay the narrow strait between Scylla and Charybdis, the two worst things the sea had to offer, close enough that avoiding one meant sailing within reach of the other. On one side, Charybdis, a massive whirlpool that swallowed the sea whole 3 times a day and spat it back out. If a ship caught its pull, it was gone. On the other side, Scylla, a 6-headed monster embedded in the cliff face, with each mouth lined with rows of teeth. She ate whatever passed close enough to reach. Circe had told him there was no way through without losing men. The only choice was which loss to accept. Odysseus chose Scylla. A whirlpool could take the whole ship. 6 heads could only take 6 men. He told his crew about Charybdis. He didn't tell them about Scylla. They rowed into the strait with their eyes on the whirlpool, watching the water spiral downward into a darkness that had no bottom. They didn't see Scylla until the screaming started. 6 of his men, snatched from their benches mid-stroke, lifted into the air, still holding their oars, calling out his name as they disappeared into the cliff. He watched and did nothing because there was nothing to do. He had made the right decision. He knew that. It didn't make it easier to live with. They made it through the strait and didn't stop until they found land. They landed next on the island of Thrinacia, the island of Helios, the sun god, where his sacred cattle grazed on grass so green it seemed to glow. Tiresias and Circe had both warned him. The message had been the same both times, and it could not have been clearer. Do not touch the cattle. Whatever happens, do not touch them. The men swore an oath they would not touch them. Then the winds died. For a month, the fleet sat stranded on the island with no wind to sail and supplies running out. Odysseus spent his days scouting the shore and his nights watching the sky, waiting for a break that never came. And slowly, as hunger set in and the days blurred together, the oath began to feel like a suggestion. He left the camp one afternoon to pray alone. When he came back, the smell of roasting meat reached him before the camp did. His men had slaughtered the cattle. He stood at the edge of the camp and felt despair settle in. Not at them, not entirely, but at the weight of what had just become inevitable. He had brought them through the Cyclops, through the Laestrygonians, through Scylla and Charybdis, and the land of the dead. And now, on a quiet island with green grass and no monsters, they had destroyed themselves. The winds returned the next day, as if the sea had been waiting for exactly this. They sailed out into open water. For a few hours, everything seemed fine. Then the sky turned black. The storm Helios called down on them was not like the others. It was deliberate, personal. Zeus himself split the ship's mast with a bolt of lightning, and what followed was not a shipwreck. It was an execution. The sea took everything. The mast, the hull, the oars. Every man who had sailed with him from Troy, who had survived 10 years of war and months of impossible odds, was gone within minutes. Odysseus clung to pieces of wreckage through the night, alone on an ocean that had swallowed everything he had left. By morning, the current had pulled him back toward the strait, back toward Charybdis, which was just beginning its pull. He grabbed onto the branch of a fig tree growing from the cliff above and hung there, feet dangling over the darkness, until the whirlpool released the wreckage back to the surface. He dropped onto it and paddled with his hands. For 9 days, he drifted. On the 10th, a shore appeared in the distance. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know how long he had been at sea. He only knew one thing. He was still alive, which was more than he could say for anyone else. He dragged himself onto the beach and lay there without moving. The island was called Ogygia, and the woman who found him there was not going to let him leave. 7 years. 7 years trapped on an island he could never leave. That was how long Odysseus stayed on Ogygia. Not because he wanted to, but because Calypso wouldn't let him leave. She was not a monster. That was what made it unbearable. She was a goddess, ancient, beautiful, and genuinely in love with the man she had pulled from the sea. She gave him everything he needed to survive. And then she offered him something no mortal had ever been offered before: immortality, eternal youth, a life without death or loss. All he had to do was stay. Odysseus refused. Every morning he walked to the edge of the island and stared west, thinking about Penelope, about Ithaca, about a son who had been a boy when he left and was now a man he had never met. No island, however beautiful, was worth more than that. 7 years passed that way. It was Zeus who ended it. He sent Hermes with orders. Release him. Calypso didn't argue, but before she let him go, she asked if he was sure. She reminded him what was waiting on the other side. More danger, more suffering. A homecoming that would not be easy. He already knew. He chose it anyway. She helped him build a raft and gave him fair winds and a sky full of stars to navigate by. For 17 days the sea was calm, and Ithaca felt closer than it had in years. Then Poseidon found him. The storm that followed was sudden and absolute. The raft came apart in minutes. Odysseus was thrown into the water and swam for 2 days straight before a shoreline appeared through the waves. He dragged himself onto the beach and lay still. No ship, no crew, no weapons, no name that anyone here would recognize. But the voices he could hear nearby told him one thing: he had reached land. And wherever this was, it was one step closer to home. While Odysseus was fighting to get home, home was falling apart without him. Ithaca had a king, everyone knew that. But a king who had been gone for 20 years might as well not exist. And into that vacuum walked the suitors, dozens of them. Sons of noble families from across the islands, all convinced that Odysseus was dead and that whoever married his widow would inherit his kingdom. They moved into the palace, ate his food, drank his wine, and treated his home like their own, day after day, year after year. Penelope held them off the only way she could. She told them she would choose a husband once the burial shroud for Odysseus's aging father was finished. Every day she wove. Every night she unraveled what she had done. For 3 years she bought time with nothing but a loom and a lie, until one of her own servants betrayed her secret. The suitors were not amused. They pushed harder. And through all of it, there was Telemachus, the son Odysseus had left behind as a newborn. Now, a young man who had grown up in a house full of men who disrespected his father's name and helped themselves to everything his father had built. He had no army, no allies, no way to force them out, just the burning certainty that his father was still alive somewhere, and the helplessness of standing there while it happened. Until Athena appeared to him. The goddess of wisdom had been watching Odysseus for years, waiting for the moment to step in. She came to Telemachus disguised as an old family friend and told him what he needed to hear, that his father was alive, that he needed to act, that sitting in his own hall while strangers consumed his inheritance was unacceptable. She told him to sail, to find news of his father, to become the man the situation required. Telemachus listened. He gathered a small crew in secret, slipped out of the harbor before the suitors could stop him, and sailed to find anyone who might know what had happened to Odysseus. He visited the courts of Nestor and Menelaus, old companions from the war, and heard stories of the men who had made it back and the ones who hadn't. Menelaus told him what he knew, that Odysseus was alive, stranded on an island somewhere, kept there against his will. It was enough. Telemachus turned his ship toward home, carrying the first real news of his father in 20 years. The suitors, meanwhile, had found out about his voyage, and they were already planning how to make sure he never made it back. Odysseus had been in the water for 2 days before he found land. He hadn't arrived, he had survived. And the shore that received him belonged to the Phaeacians. He was still lying on the beach where he'd collapsed, exhausted, covered in salt and dried blood, with barely enough strength left to stand. It was a young woman who found him first. Nausicaa, the king's daughter, had come to the river with her handmaids to do the washing. When Odysseus emerged from the shoreline, wild-looking and barely clothed, the other women scattered. Nausicaa stayed. There was something in the way he spoke, carefully, respectfully, with the instincts of a man who understood people even at his lowest, that told her this was no ordinary castaway. She gave him clothes, showed him the way to the palace, and told him to go to the queen. If the queen took pity on him, the rest would follow. He followed her advice exactly. The Phaeacian court received him well. King Alcinous and Queen Arete listened to his request, passage home, and agreed without hesitation. But first, they wanted to know who he was, where he had come from, what had brought him to their shore in that condition. So Odysseus told them everything, every storm, every island, every loss, the whole long disaster of the last 10 years, told by the man who had lived it, in a hall full of people who had never heard anything like it. When he finished, the room was silent. Alcinous stood and announced that the Phaeacians would take him home. A ship would be ready by morning, crewed by the finest sailors in the world, with enough gifts to send him back as a king, not a castaway. That night, while the palace slept and his fate had already been decided, the Phaeacians carried him aboard without waking him, and he didn't open his eyes again until the ship touched the sand of Ithaca. When he opened his eyes, he didn't recognize where he was. A thick mist covered everything, making the island look like a place he had never been. He sat up, felt the first edge of panic. And then, Athena appeared beside him. She lifted the mist. He was home, but she didn't let him celebrate. She told him what was waiting inside that palace. Dozens of men who had spent years eating his food, drinking his wine, and pressuring his wife. Men who would kill him the moment they recognized him. Walking in as king would be a death sentence. So instead, she changed him. With a touch, she aged him. His skin roughened, his posture bent, his strength hidden beneath the appearance of a beggar. Anyone who looked at him would see an old vagrant, not a king, not a threat. He looked down at his own hands and barely recognized them. Athena told him to go to the hut of Eumaeus, his most loyal swineherd, and wait. She would take care of the rest. 20 years of war and wandering, and he was finally standing on the soil of Ithaca. But the hardest part was still ahead. He picked up his walking stick and started down the road. Eumaeus didn't know who he was. That was the point. The old swineherd welcomed the stranger the way a decent man welcomes anyone who arrives tired and hungry, with food, a fire, and no questions that couldn't wait. He complained about the suitors, about the state of the palace, about the absence of a king who would have never allowed any of it. He spoke about Odysseus, the way people speak about the dead, with grief that had settled into something permanent. Odysseus sat across the fire and listened to a man mourn him while he was still alive. It was Telemachus who arrived next, slipping back into Ithaca ahead of the suitors who had been waiting to ambush him at sea. Athena had warned him. He came to Eumaeus first, and when he walked into the hut and saw the old beggar sitting by the fire, he thought nothing of it. Until Odysseus revealed himself. Athena restored his appearance for just a moment. The gray burned away, the posture straightened, the eyes sharpened. And Telemachus stared at the man in front of him and couldn't speak. His father, after 20 years, sitting in a swineherd's hut in the disguise of a beggar. They held each other and wept. Then Odysseus pulled back and told his son there was no time for that yet. He laid out the plan. Telemachus would go back to the palace first, alone, and say nothing. Odysseus would follow as the beggar, and no matter what happened, no matter what the suitors did or said, Telemachus would not react. Not yet. They would wait for the right moment, and when it came, they would move fast. Telemachus listened, then nodded. He was his father's son, and he knew it. Odysseus entered the palace the next day on foot, staff in hand, head down, an old beggar looking for scraps. The suitors mocked him immediately. One of them threw a stool at him. Another challenged him to a fight and immediately regretted it when the old man moved with a speed that didn't match his appearance. He moved through the hall, watching, counting, memorizing faces and positions and where the weapons were stored. He had done this before, walked into enemy territory disguised as someone harmless and come back with everything he needed to know, in places far worse than this. Then Penelope sent for him. She wanted to speak to the stranger who had come to the palace. Something about him had caught her attention. They sat together, and he told her a carefully constructed lie about who he was. but woven through it were truths about Odysseus, details only someone who had known him could possibly know. Penelope listened without showing what she felt. She had survived 20 years by never showing what she felt. She told him she had decided to hold a contest. Whoever could string Odysseus's bow and send an arrow through 12 axe heads in a row, that man she would marry. The old beggar nodded slowly and said nothing. He didn't need to. That night, as the palace settled into silence, an old servant woman named Euryclea washed his feet, a courtesy offered to guests. Her hands moved across a scar on his thigh, a scar she had known for 40 years and would never forget, a scar from a hunting wound he had gotten as a young man. She looked up at him, her mouth opened. He caught her wrist before she could make a sound. "Not yet," he said quietly. She closed her mouth and said nothing. The morning of the contest, Penelope brought out the bow herself, Odysseus's bow, the one he had left behind when he sailed for Troy, the one no one had touched in 20 years. Heavy, curved, strung with a tension that had broken the wrists of men who tried it. She set it before the suitors, along with 12 axe heads lined up in a row, and repeated the terms. String the bow, shoot an arrow, clean through all 12. Whoever managed it, she would marry. The suitors went one by one. Some couldn't even bend it. Others got it halfway and gave up. The strongest among them strained until their faces went red and their hands shook. And still the bow refused. While they were distracted, Odysseus slipped out and revealed himself to two trusted servants, his old swineherd Eumaeus and his cowherd Philoetius. He showed them the scar. They recognized it instantly and dropped to their knees. He told them what he needed. Lock the doors to the great hall. Secure the weapons room. Let no one in or out when it started. They nodded and asked no questions. Back inside, the last suitor had failed. They were debating whether to try again the next day when the old beggar spoke up from the corner and asked if he could have a turn. The suitors laughed. Penelope said yes. Odysseus picked up the bow and turned it over slowly, running his hands along the wood as if greeting an old friend. The room watched with contempt. Then he strung it, in one smooth motion, without effort. The laughter died. He notched an arrow, drew and sent it clean through all 12 axe heads without touching a single one. Then he looked up at the suitors, and the beggar was gone. What stood in his place was the king of Ithaca. Telemachus appeared at his side with a sword and spear. Eumaeus and Philoetius came through the locked doors with weapons. The suitors scrambled for the armory and found it bolted. They grabbed whatever was close, chairs, tables, anything. It didn't matter. What followed was not a fight, it was a reckoning. Odysseus moved through the hall like a man who had been waiting for this moment since the day he returned. Arrow after arrow found its mark. When the quiver was empty, he drew his sword. The suitors fell one by one, some begging, some cursing. None of it mattered. When it was over, the hall was silent except for the sound of breathing. He stood among the dead and looked around at the home he had fought 20 years to return to. Then he called for Euryclea and told her to bring Penelope. Penelope didn't run. She walked into the hall slowly, the way a woman walks when she has learned not to trust good news. She had been fooled before, or almost fooled. She had spent 20 years keeping hope at a distance precisely because hope was dangerous. And so she stood at the entrance to the great hall, looked at the man sitting by the fire with blood on his hands and 20 years written on his face, and she didn't move. The servants whispered. Telemachus couldn't understand her stillness, but Odysseus could. He sat and waited because he knew her, because he understood that the woman who had held an entire kingdom together with nothing but patience and wit was not going to throw herself at a stranger just because someone said it was him. She tested him. She told Euryclea, loud enough for him to hear, to move the bed out of the bridal chamber, to set it up somewhere else for the stranger to sleep. Odysseus reacted before he could stop himself. That bed couldn't be moved. He had built it himself years ago, carved from a living olive tree that still grew through the floor of their room. Its roots went into the earth. It didn't move. No one alive knew that, except him and her, and one trusted servant. Penelope heard him describe it, and something inside her that had been locked for 20 years came open all at once. She crossed the room and held him, and this time, he didn't pull back. They talked through the night, filling everything that had been left unsaid. He told her everything. She told him everything. The loom, the suitors, the waiting, the years of not knowing if he was alive or already gone. He listened to all of it without looking away. In the days that followed, he went to see his father Laertes, old, worn down by grief, who had spent years mourning a son he believed was gone. When Odysseus stood before him, Laertes reached out and touched his face, slowly, carefully, as if he still didn't fully believe it. He believed it. Athena moved through Ithaca one last time, quieting the families of the dead suitors before the violence could begin again. Not with force, with exhaustion. She made them understand, in a way that made it clear the fighting was over, that the king was home, that whatever came next would have to be built on something other than revenge. The island went quiet, and Odysseus, who had survived Troy, the Cyclops, the Sirens, the land of the dead, 7 years of captivity, and a sea that had tried to kill him more times than he could count, sat in his own home, in his own chair, beside the woman he had crossed the world to return to. It had taken 20 years. It had cost everything, and it was enough.